In France, remember they had these big protests, right? Because the French president raised the retirement age from 62 to 64. Well, why were so many people protesting that? Well, it's because in France, the salaries aren't enough to keep up.
Whether Americans just over time, over the long term, are more lightly taxed or more heavily taxed. It seems like they're always piling on more and more taxes. What are your thoughts with where we're going on lighter taxation or heavier taxation?
We're actually taxed less than just about any other country. We pay a lower share of our income in taxes than just about any other country. But of course, we have many fewer benefits. We don't have national health care. We have Social Security, but it's a small amount, right? In France, remember they had these big protests, right? Because the French president raised the retirement age from 62 to 64. Well, why were so many people protesting that? Well, it's because in France, the salaries aren't enough to keep up. And so they're relying on that. I mean, they can't save up and say, I'm going to retire earlier because I've saved up money. They just don't, there's not enough income for them to save. So they're relying on the government to save for them. And so that was a hard thing for them. We have a hard time understanding that in the US because our tax rates are so much lower. France, for example, let me give you an example. I was reading this the other day. 50% of GDP goes to taxes. In the US, it's about 26% of GDP. So we're almost half of what percentage of our GDP goes to taxes. And they're the highest. So they're the highest, but you see what's happening is you're seeing Germany, theirs is going up. Korea, theirs has gone up. Japan, theirs has gone up. And the US, they expect ours to be up at 28% of GDP within a few years. So it's all relative, right? The problem is that we've got the taxes are more and more as a proportion of our gross domestic product. And, if you think the government should stay out of our lives, then you're on the wrong end of that stick, because that means that the government's getting more and more involved and more money is being spent by the government instead of the private sector.
Well, Tom, you've been here on the show with us a lot of times. We've talked about how your rental income gets taxed. We've talked about capital gains tax and property tax and sales tax and income tax. One tax type we haven't talked about when we think about whether things just get worse as the government piles on more taxes, is there any threat in your mind of a capitation tax? For those that don't know what that is, that's basically a head tax. That's a tax that's imposed on you just for existing. Is that a possibility?
Well, as long as it's capitation tax, not a decapitation tax.
It might feel like one. Yeah.
Commonly called a poll tax. Right, poll as in POLL. You go to the polls. That's a number of people. That is actually allowed. The government could impose that. That is allowed under our Constitution, a poll tax. Great Britain has a poll tax, so it's not unheard of. I haven't heard a lot of people talk about it. The problem is that a poll tax is a tax on voters. And we know politicians don't like to put a tax on voters, right? So
where's the incentive to vote?
They're more likely to put a tax on corporations who don't vote. I'll tell you the favorite tax. The favorite tax is to put a tax on out-of-towners, right? Somebody who's coming into your place, like a travel tax, right? That's the favorite. You always want, one of the key policy points of any tax unit is you want to export your tax to people who don't vote for you. So you're always trying to put the tax on somebody who can't vote for you. Because if you put it on the people who do vote for you, you will soon lose your job.
Interesting point.
Right? So that's why you see taxes on Ubers and taxis, hotels, resort taxes. You see those kind of taxes. Those are basically export tax, right? They're taxing people who don't live and vote in your state or in your location. A poll tax would be a tax on people who do live in your state or location. I have a hard time seeing that one coming down the line. You really wanted us to be more competitive with the rest of the world. We'd have a value-added tax in the United States. We do not have one. And if you wanted to make us more competitive with the rest of the world, if you really want to raise funds or you want to pay off the deficit or you want to get rid of an income tax, the best way to do it would be a value-added tax.
Well, maybe you, the listener, just have a shred of a little something to be thankful for. There are tax types you've heard of that we don't actually have yet. There actually are some remaining. It seems like they'll all get used up.
Europe uniformly has a 20% value-added tax. That just increases the price of your meals at a restaurant, increases the price of every product you buy. That's a value-added tax. That is common in the rest of the world. We're the only major developed country that doesn't have one.
Well, at least in Europe, they're not asking that when you get your restaurant meal bill that you add a tip onto the tax amount like what's happening a lot of times here. And I think a lot of people aren't even aware of that. That's another absurdity.
Another tax.
Yeah, another absurdity of being a consumer in the United States today. You can watch this one next.